Part 15, Chapter 13 of the Dragon's Scourge. High on the steep rocky mountainside, cool, crisp winds buffeted him and sent his clothes flapping against his body. The Clove was standing in front of a large door made out of solid beams of petrified white oak. "Oh dear, there might be a problem," the black cat mewed worriedly. The Clove's sharp yellow eyes shifted upward as he steadied himself while hungrily watching the birds fly near their nests along the rock outcropping above them. The steep terrain combined with the high winds made the climb treacherous. "The Clove, I need a drop of your blood to—" "The Clove." Kita paused in mid-sentence and glanced upward, seeing him scaling up the cliff face. "What the hell are you doing up there?" she exclaimed. "Looking for breakfast," the Clove shouted back down at her. But just as he neared the top, he came across a very curious rock formation. He moved closer and pulled aside some branches to find a small opening to a cave. There appeared to be a faint tinge of light coming from within the cave. "That's strange," he mused out loud. The black cat down below tilted her head to the side. "What's strange? What's going on? We're in a hurry," she protested, running up the slope after him. Although the Clove disliked magic, the thrill of adventure surpassed his hunger for food. Besides, the eggs wouldn't be flying off any time soon, he told himself. He slipped into the narrow cave entrance, pressed his ear against the smooth stone walls, and could hear the running water. Intrigued, he ventured forward down a narrow, gloomy tunnel. His curiosity overcame any thought of turning back. The cave was more extensive than the Clove had imagined. He crawled further into the tunnel until the sleek limestone walls expanded into a massive chamber filled with stalactites and stalagmites that formed intricate pillars. The Clove gasped and shielded his eyes as he was suddenly blinded by the sunlight that came streaming in from the far side of the chamber. Long ago, the mountainside had been cut away by a subterranean river that shimmered like diamonds as it cascaded down. Even though he had never set foot in a mansion, the Clove felt as if he was in one as he walked amongst the high archways and the long stone columns. The natural beauty was so breathtaking that he did not take notice to the man-made carvings on the wall. As he went along, the carvings became more elaborate, causing the Clove to be on his guard. "The Clove, wait! This is dangerous! You don't know where you're going!" The Clove paused and looked up at a tall wooden platform suspended in air on 4 15-foot wooden posts. It could have been an abandoned lookout post or a hunting stand, although he couldn't quite figure out why anyone would put something like that here. The Clove spotted a ladder covered in dust and cobwebs and was inclined to investigate. Kita, of course, was not pleased, and she ran about in frantic circles. "This is a bad idea," she mewed from the base of the wobbly ladder. "This is really bad, Le Clove." The wooden poles creaked as he climbed the ladder to the top. He hadn't expected to find much, perhaps some small clues as to what sort of people had previously inhabited the vast mountain cave, broken pottery or forgotten tools. But to his surprise, the small platform was laden with antlers, fur pellets, bags of colorful beads, and ivory-handled hunting knives, all set neatly over a large black bear hide. Everything was covered in dust. The platform had not been disturbed for a very long time. The Clove's eyes were alight with excitement. Suspecting he would find even more treasure beneath the heavy bearskin, he pulled it back and saw a bleached white skull grinning back up at him beneath a golden death mask covered in red rubies and long black feathers. Frozen in shock, he heard a haunting, droning sound that caused the stone chamber walls to shudder. It was so terrifying, he felt his heart leap into his throat. In panic, he jumped back and nearly fell off the high platform. Fortunately, he caught himself just in time before the ladder slid away, leaving him stranded on the platform. The ancient skeleton's broken jaws were agape, open as if in silent laughter. The Clove cursed under his breath as a mournful chanting, followed by ominous ceremonial drums, echoed through the large cavern. Just his luck. He had stumbled upon some sort of burial ground. He glanced down at the bleached white skeletal remains beside him, and then at the long lines of soldiers armed with glistening spears that were led by 4 shamans, followed by men playing strange, twisted horns and drums. The shamans' bodies were covered in black paint, and they wore large masks resembling crows, complete with beaks. Behind them, the chanting mourners were carrying a stretcher covered in flowers. The Clove knew all too well that if they caught him inside their sacred burial grounds, he would be a dead man. "Hey, hurry! Help me with the ladder!" he called it down to Kita. "It's too late!" she exclaimed, darting off into the shadows. "Hide!" Out of options, the Clove morbidly slid next to the remains of the dead chieftain. "Move over," he muttered, doing his best to make light of the gruesome act of lying beside a corpse. He pulled the bearskin over his head and hoped the mourners would pass him by. However, this was not what happened. In fact, they seemed to be getting closer. The bearskin was hot, and the tinge of death was rank in his nostrils. He couldn't wait until they finished their little ritual and left so that he could get away from this place. Suddenly, he felt the wooden post shake as the ladder was set back onto the platform. The Clove's eyes snapped wide open, and he went stiff as a board. His blood went cold, and his heart stopped. The drums and the chanting were louder now as the shamans began to ascend the ladder. What was he going to do? Just as they climbed onto the platform, the Clove grabbed the dead chieftain's mask and leapt out from beneath the bearskin, screaming like a banshee and waving about a skeletal hand. "Booga booga booga booga!" Scared senseless, the shamans took one look at the yellow-eyed creature and leapt off the platform, shouting, "Phantismo! Phantismo! Phantismo!" To the Clove's amazement, the warriors dropped their weapons and cried out in terror as the shamans began running around in panic. The Clove could barely contain himself. He might have fallen over laughing, except that they would have killed him if they ever found him out. He climbed down on the ladder, waving the skeleton hand over his head and shrieking like a lunatic as everyone fled the chamber. The Clove grabbed the torch and ducked down a corridor to escape the chaos. As he hurried down the dark tunnel, he could hear them shouting, "Phantismo!" as they ran. When the shouts died down, the Clove relaxed, and he chuckled to himself as he wandered down the passageway until he came across a skeleton lying on the damp ground with a broken arrow protruding from the side of his neck. The Clove frowned and lifted his torch above his head to see down the path. The flickering firelight revealed dozens more skeletons littered the floor of the dark corridor. The Clove cursed under his breath as he stepped around the bones. From their appearance, they had died in combat. Some, even now, which were once mortal enemies, now lay locked in eternal embrace, sword through one ribcage and dagger in another. The Clove glanced down and noted the slot carved into the stone wall. It seemed to be the epicenter of the violence. A little further off, he saw the smashed remnants of a wooden box, and his heart sank a little in disappointment. Obviously, whatever they had been fighting over was of great value, but from the looks of things, it had been taken. Farther down the tunnel, he found more bones. These were slain not by his sword, but rather crushed by falling boulders and wooden spikes protruding from the walls. Just then, the Clove noticed something shiny in the torchlight. Stooping down, he saw the rusted armor of a knight who had not been killed or mangled by some contraption, but it appeared that he had been wounded by a blade from behind. The Clove kicked the rusted corpse over with the heel of his boot, revealing a long silver chain dangling from his leather glove, and a piece of parchment stained with blood. The Clove eagerly pried them from the dead man's hand, and discovered a map that had been torn away from a larger piece of manuscript. "Here we go. Now this is something," the Clove mused out loud. Perhaps it wasn't treasure, but it could be useful. He hoped it would lead him out of this hellhole without being impaled by some strange contraption or crossing the superstitious natives. He was not too worried, for he still had the burial mask for that very reason. A little further down the cavern, the Clove saw a white light shining up from a hole in the middle of the floor. He hastily put out his torch and stood quietly for a long moment. His sharp yellow eyes focused on the white light as he listened for any sign that his presence had been detected. He silently crept closer to sneak a glance down the hole. Down below stood a masked man in a black mail tunic and dark cobalt blue mask that covered his face, and expensive leather braces and new leather boots. Slightly distracted by the leather boots, the Clove compared his foot size to the tracks left behind. Way too small, he thought. It was then he wondered why the man was here at all. Surely the shining orb in his hand was of far more value than anything that he was looking over. And down below, this strange masked man was surrounded by riches. Yet it was clear the man did not lack wealth. Then again, there was nothing wrong with more wealth. The Clove himself had a sack full of golden coins. He needed boots, though. Some good boots that weren't worn out. The Clove might have been content to keep his distance, but then he noticed a corpse holding a leather-bound book, which appeared to be the book from which his missing page had been torn. Most likely, the backstabber had wrenched it from the knight's hands, only to fall down the hole, landing on the sharpened spikes at the bottom. The Clove grinned mischievously as he put on the burial mask, and then leapt down in the chamber beneath him, shouting, "Booga, booga, booga!" from the top of his lungs, while waving his hands and hopping about like a lunatic. Completely taken off guard, the masked man leapt back in shock, but he didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground and stared at the savage blankly as the madman continued to hop and prance about. Assuming the man was frozen in his fear, the Clove shouted again, "Booga, booga, boo!" He jumped up and down and flailed his hands about, but for all his efforts, the masked man didn't so much as blink. Instead, the rasp of a sleek sword blade being pulled from a metal scabbard echoed through the stone walls. Clove gave up and burst out laughing hysterically, both at himself and at the masked man's reaction to his bizarre entrance. It had not worked as it had before. Tossing the mask aside, he grinned. "Ha ha ha! I don't suppose it's too late to be friends," he offered cheerfully. The masked swordsman, however, thrust the point of his sword toward him. Clove merely laughed. "Hey, I'm just trying to get out of here," he declared, and raised his hand, trying to appear friendly while at the same time keeping close to the hilt of his cutlass. The masked warrior eyed him with distrust. Sensing his unease, Clove's bright yellow eyes hardened, and his smile became less friendly and more tenacious. "Just take what you want and go," he commanded sternly. The peculiar stranger studied his opponent for a brief moment, and turned as if to leave, when suddenly he whirled around. A blinding white light exploded from the crystal sphere in his hand, sending Clove staggering backward in a blind daze. The Clove cursed inwardly when he felt the trip line break at his feet. Expecting the worst, the Clove put his hands up over his head, expecting to be crushed by fallen boulders or impaled by a hidden spear flying out from the darkness. But instead, freezing cold water came pouring down on top of him from a hole in the wall. The Clove scrambled up to his feet, gasping, out of breath, and he began to laugh when he realized it was all right. The masked man came lunging at him, but the Clove rolled away and sprang to his feet with a series of swift counterattacks that sent sparks and water flying every time their blades clashed together. "Ha ha! It's only a bit of water," Clove taunted his rival as he splashed it into his face with the flat of his blade, hoping to goad him into losing his composure. However, just as he said this, he heard the stone wall behind him shift and crack. His opponent stepped back, and his eyes widened, sensing the impending doom as water came spraying from the cracks in the wall. The stone walls suddenly collapsed as water came blasting through the chamber, engulfing them both in its path. The two men were carried away into the dark subterranean channels. Just as Clove thought his lungs would burst, they emerged into a swift river that spilled into the main cavern. Fortunately for them, the river was shallow, and Clove scrambled to his feet before being swept over the waterfall that rushed into the sunlight and open blue skies. Clove coughed and spluttered as he struggled to keep his footing. He quickly glanced about and spotted the masked man frantically struggling to grasp the glowing white orb. Taking full advantage of the situation, Clove ran up and viciously kicked him in the face, sending him sprawling back into the river. Blood gushed into the water, but the assassin held out the gleaming white orb in a threatening gesture. Sensing the magic expanding from it, the Clove snarled and slashed out wildly, hoping to knock the white stone from the warrior's hand. He missed the stone, but he shattered the silver chain in half. The white light faded, and the warrior let out a mournful shriek and turned on the Clove, wielding his long, double-bladed sword, striking and slashing in a flurry of vengeful attacks. The Clove leapt away from the warrior's blade and struck his cutlass across the brittle tip of a 5-foot-long stalagmite, sending a blast of stone fragments into the warrior's face. His opponent let out a cry of pain and held up his sword in a defensive motion as he staggered back with his face buried into his forearm, desperately trying to find relief from his burning eyes and regain his vision. But Clove quickly knocked the blade from the disoriented warrior's hand and reached out to seize the fabric of his mask. Adding insult to injury, he twisted the eye slits to the back of his opponent's head, and before he could recover, a glove threw him into the river, kicking him in the ribs until he collapsed into a decrepit ball. Clove's yellow eyes blazed as he raised his cutlass for the final killing thrust. When, at that very moment, for the first time, the warrior pulled down the mask, revealing long raven-black hair, fair ivory skin, and deep blue piercing eyes. Even with blood running down her face, she was beautiful. The Glue's sword arm stiffened. He stared down, breathing heavily through clenched teeth, and hesitated. Suddenly there was a flash of steel, and the Clove howled in pain and staggered back as a knife meant for his heart buried itself deep into his shoulder. Gasping in pain, the Clove stared at the mysterious woman in shock. Suddenly, a javelin whizzed past his head, followed by dozens of fearsome war cries and the sound of rattling weapons reverberating off the cavern walls. Clutching his wounded shoulder, he whirled around to see the chamber filled with angry warriors, wielding spears and strange, twisted blades. The Clove let out an angry growl. Although outnumbered, he felt driven to embrace the oncoming conflict. A strange rush of heat enveloped him. He felt invisible, as if nothing could stop him. His eyes burned like yellow molten metal as he crossed swords with the first warrior to come rushing at him. The Clove ruthlessly shoved him with brute force down into the river and laughed insanely as he pulled the dagger from his shoulder, letting the hot blood flow, hiss, and steam violently in the water, creating a surreal mist around him, causing the warriors to halt in their tracks. Just then, a round river stone struck the back of his head. Clove turned to see the woman who stood silently before him with her sleek sword on guard, making a point that she wanted to kill him in a fair fight rather than stabbing him in the back, which she clearly could have done. The angry natives fell silent as they gathered around to watch the pair of invaders turn on one another, allowing them to duel. The Clove's nostrils flared and he growled with contempt as he gripped his cutlass. Without warning, he rushed at her. Their swords crashed and sparks flashed in the sunlight, but try as he might, the mysterious woman proved to be very nimble. She hastily retreated, using the bright sunlight at her back to change her form into a dark silhouette. Though blood gushed from her bruised face, she showed no sign of pain or emotion as she weaved in and out of the sunlight. This infuriated Clove all the more, but when it seemed he finally had the killing stroke, she disappeared out of sight. The Clove rushed forward, and then blue skies opened up, and the ground beneath his feet fell away, and he was engulfed in a white mist, and red, orange, green, blue, violet beams of light. The feeling of falling was surreal. One moment he was consumed in the madness of battle, and the next he was overtaken with dreamlike serenity of weightlessness. The sensation quickly turned to one of dread as he plummeted head over heels off the mountain waterfall. The wind raced past him at such a high speed that it stole the breath from his lungs. He could not even cry out in terror when he saw the crystal blue, bottomless depths below him. The cascading waters that came from the high mountain cliff broke up in a fine white mist that refracted the light into an enormous rainbow. Moments later, the clove hit the water surface, and the entire right side of his body was stricken in stinging pain. He cried out in anguish, but the cold water muffled the sound as it rushed into his lungs and churned the current, dragging him down into the fathomless depths. All he could think about was keeping hold of his father's sword, or else he would lose it forever. The clove clung to the cutlass as he thrashed toward the glistening water's surface. It seemed like his lungs would burst, but just as everything was beginning to go black, his feet touched the ground on the pebbly lake bed. The clove lurched out of the water, holding his cutlass over his head as he stumbled to shore. He collapsed on the dry ground onto his hands and knees, coughing and choking up water that he had inhaled. He shook his head and chuckled to himself. But before he could feel too good about his brush with death, he saw 2 nice black leather boots. From where he knelt, he recognized they were too sleek and slender to be a man's. He had a hunch as to whom they belonged, but before his gaze could drift upwards to confirm his suspicions, he received a sharp kick to the head. Coming up next, Part 16, Chapter 14. You've been listening to The Dragon Scourge by M.R.R. Lopez. If you'd like to support me, you can find the book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble website, both in paperback and Kindle.